Okay, welcome to our session on reading like an Australian writer, an exciting panel discussion. My name is Isabel Hess and I'm from the English department. But before I start the session properly, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work, so the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Belinda Castles, Felicity Castanya and Stephanie Bishop to a panel discussion of reading like an Australian writer, which is a really exciting edited collection that came out in 2021. And they're here today to discuss their different contributions to this book. If you'd like a free copy of the book, there will be some available today, Wednesday, 16th of February in Woolly Common Room between 2 and 4 p.m. And we also have a book club tomorrow, Thursday, on the 17th of February at 2 p.m. in Woolly Common Room, where we have a fun activity-based book club where we discuss Felicity and Stephanie's essays in a bit more depth and also just more generally get a sense of what it's like to study English text and think about writers and readers. So I'd like to introduce our host today, Belinda Castles from the English department. So Belinda is an award-winning author of 4 novels, most recently Blue Bottle. She studied and taught in UK and Australia and returned to Sydney a few years ago after being a lecturer in creative writing and the director of the MA in creative writing at the University of Exeter. She's the editor of the exciting edited collection we're discussing today, but she's also published a series of interesting novels, for example, Blue Bottle, which I just mentioned, which is set on the northern beaches of Sydney and explores the repercussions of an event in the family's history. Her novel before that, Hannah and Emil, was based on the lives of her grandfather, a German refugee, an internee in Australian wartime camps, and her grandmother, a Russian Jewish interpreter raised in the West End of London. So I'll hand you over to Belinda, who will be the host for this session, and she can then introduce Felicity and Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. It's great to be here, and I would like to acknowledge that I am very happily back on Gadigal land today at university. I pay my respects to the traditional owners and express my deep gratitude to be here. So I thought first, I'll just introduce myself briefly, although I've had a comprehensive introduction, and so just say a little bit about the premise of the book, and then I will be speaking with our guests, Felicity Castanya and Stephanie Bishop. I am a writing teacher here at the University of Sydney and also the coordinator of the creative writing program. So if you are watching this recording and you are one of our new students, please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions. So I'm also the editor of this book, Reading Like an Australian Writer. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about the collection's reason for being. It's a collection of essays by writers on writers, in part for writers, but really for anyone interested in how fiction works and how influence operates, what Australian fiction looks like, and how writers articulate their reading practices. The title you may sound familiar to you. It's stolen blatantly from Francine Crozi's creative writing guide, Reading Like a Writer. And the reason I admired that book so much was because she made something explicit that writers do consciously and unconsciously all the time, and looks at one of the uses of literature as being what it might give to other writers. It's a particular kind of reading, I think. One of the contributors to the collection, Maria Takalanda, begins her essay by saying that intertextuality, the generative relationship of text to text, is the secret force that powers our writing. And this is quite a different view to the idea that you must avoid influence. It's the exact opposite. Takalanda explains that ancient Greek audiences experienced, quote, a sense of communitas through repeated engagement with a communal repository of stories. And I would like to repurpose this idea of communitas in introducing this collection to you to suggest that Australian stories have provided Australian readers and writers with a place to return to continually for enrichment. I'm reminded too of something Malcolm Knox says in his essay in Deborah Adelaide's The Simple Act of Reading. By digesting books, I am creating myself. And I think we can all recognise that feeling that we as writers are made of the books that we've read. All writers begin as readers, I write in the introduction. As a reader who has become a writer, I believe in a spark that catches, and that spark is sometimes ignited by forms of familiarity and recognition. So in the context of Australian writing, national writing, this need not be a comforting kind of familiarity. I mean a kind of recognition of experience, place, language, and ways of being, even if these can be contradictory or at odds. The sense in these essays is very much that discovering certain stories expands the limits of what's possible to say, encourages our ambitions and offers license. These stories are enabling, they provide fuel. One of our contributors, Nicholas Jose, has elsewhere called Australian literature a body in time, a connective body of material, an entity that moves beyond the individual to a community of writers and readers, linked through history and geography and culture, a set of relationships. To me, this is a wonderful conception of Australian literature, particularly in the way it suggests a nourishing in the writing of others. So let's move on from the sound of my voice and hear from our wonderful contributors. So I will introduce them to you first. Felicity Castanya is an essayist, teacher and writer on many cross-disciplinary art projects. Her last novel, No More Boats, was a finalist in the Miles Franklin Awards and the incredible Here and Now won the Prime Minister's Award for Literature. Very, very recently, her latest novel, Girls in Boys' Cars, with its excellent title, has won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Writing for Young Adults. Felicity teaches at Western Sydney University, and her essay in the collection is called Starting from Place, An Introduction to a Way of Thinking. Welcome, Felicity.
Thank you.
And we have Stephanie Bishop, who is the author of Man Out of Time, The Other Side of the World, and The Singing. Her work has been published in the London Review of Books, The Guardian, the Times Literary Supplement, and elsewhere, and her books have gained many shortlistings and awards. Stephanie teaches creative writing at UNSW, and her essay is called Lines of Sight, Living Images in the Short Fiction of Gerald Murnane. And as I was preparing for this panel, I was thinking how delightful and unusual it is that we have a little triangle across UNSW, Western Sydney, and Sydney. It's really fantastic to come together. So I thought I might start with just generally thinking about this business of reading like a writer. If your students, I'll ask you first, Felicity, were to ask you why that might be important and what it might involve, what would you say to them? Why read? Some of them are resistant. How do you persuade them?
I remember when I was an undergraduate and like when I was a much younger emerging writer, people always telling me to keep diaries and write down the things that I had seen. And I kind of tried to, emulate like Helen Garner and such and did that. But nothing ever came from it because I was just thinking about, I guess, myself and my own voice. And when I feel I actually started to grow as a writer is when I started to keep a reading diary. So I've done this for about 15 years now, and I write down sentences from the books that I'm reading that I just find really interesting in terms of their construction. I often write down the plot of various novels, like in its small, intimate details. I often write down things that I think are clever or unusual. And I would argue that that's how I've taught myself to write, is really by doing a very solid apprenticeship with many hundreds, thousands probably, of writers that I've never met before. And really thinking hard about the language and the technical aspects of what they're doing and why it works or why I find it exciting or not exciting as it might be. But I think that's really how we learn to write, is to learn to recognize what other people are doing and to draw on those voices in order to create our own.
I love how purposeful that is, how sort of bold, unashamed, and sort of technical as well. What are you doing, writing down? What about you, Stephanie?
I think I would borrow some of Felicity's terms quite directly, and that I think I felt something similar when I was sort of starting out, thinking that maybe that would be what you might do. A lot of emulating and mimicking, which I do think it is an apprenticeship, that kind of taking on of someone else's style and trying it out and seeing if it works for you, and discarding certain elements of it, absorbing others, and then trying to kind of transform them to something that feels right for however you're looking at the world. And I think that process goes on. I don't think that process ever really stops. It's not as though I don't still do that now. I still go looking for that sense of energy and connection that you have with certain writers that you want to learn from. So I think that there is a kind of phase for me, if I think about reading as a writer, where that was sort of self-enclosed, and that was the only way I kind of approached it. And I think maybe if I were to try and kind of reduce the process, it's probably sort of two things for me. And this was always the case even when, I was doing my undergraduate degree, a sense of reading with a real sense of wonder and curiosity and kind of bewilderment, rather than reading to try and understand what was going on or what it meant. Just to read for the kind of immersion in that world, or in the language, in the character, whatever it was. And almost trying not to distance yourself from it, but to stay inside of that work and inhabit it, and then try and recreate that experience of being contained by something in your writing. So I think there's a different approach that happens for me when I think about what it means to read as a writer, rather than to, read as an academic or just read as a reader, which is much more immersive and it becomes analytical. I think along the lines that Felicity was saying, there is a stage in that where you step back and say, what was making me feel like that? But I think you can't get to that place of analysis until you've had that sense of being overwhelmed by something that is extraordinary.
It's interesting. I sometimes read and I'm conscious of this feeling that on this reading, I'm just going to let everything happen that needs to happen. I'm not really going to think about anything. It's just things happening. And then as soon as I finish, I think, okay, now I do the other kind of reading. And I've sort of had not articulated that I do that, but you reminded me that I do. I sort of finish and go, okay, now the other kind of reading. So Felicity, are there writers that have been important for you at particular stages in your writing career? And what sort of quality was it that you were sort of attracted to?
I think when I did my undergraduate at Sydney University in Australian literature, and I think the whole reason why I studied Australian literature, is because I grew up in a very international family. We lived in multiple places growing up, and I really wanted to understand the literary canon that I wanted to write in. So I wanted to understand who had come before me and what kind of voices there were and what they were saying, and how I could respond or argue against or fit myself into that canon of work from my own country. So for me, it was really important, as an 18, 19, 20-year-old, to be reading Christina Stead and Patrick White and Ujuru. All of these kinds of writers helped me to understand, I think, the literary landscape that I wanted to be a part of. And I think that was very important for my early education and is, I think, for any writer writing from anywhere. And then later on, I think I started to be much more interested in ways of experimenting, particularly with the novel and the short story. And I was really interested in looking at, how we could play with time signatures and how we could break the rules. So I loved reading people like like Jeffrey Eugenides, or because I love the way that he plays with like time and collective voice, much like Alexis Wright does actually. And, you know, I love looking at all of the kind of Spanish writers like Borges, and I loved having a look at, you know, how they were playing with magical realism and surrealism. And I kind of oscillated, I guess, between looking at that very realist classic Australian literature and that tradition of very realist literature, and then particularly then looking overseas to find what literary traditions were not steeped in social realism like Australia's literary tradition is. And interestingly, I would argue that Australian literature is kind of no longer completely steeped in the social realist tradition. Like, I mean, people that I wrote about like Alexis Wright and Luke Carman, I think really show that. And some of our new kind of younger writers, emerging writers, you know, like Julie Coe, for example. Yeah, those two aspects are really important in my reading journey and my writing journey.
I love the purposeful of this quest. It's great to hear about. Stephanie, how about you? Any particular names popping into your head?
I was so entranced by Felicity's answer that I've forgotten the question.
Yeah. The writers that have been important for you at particular stages in your writing career.
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies a lot. My parents were really big readers, so there was always a sense of there being books around, but there was never a sense of there being national borders in terms of what we read or how we approached them. And I don't think, to be completely honest, that I ever grew up with the sense that there was Australian literature and then there was the rest of the world. You just read what you read. And that was quite exciting for me as a teenager. So I suppose one of the first influences, though, if I kind of track back and go chronologically, it would have to be my mother giving me Helen Garner's Monkey Grip when I was about, I don't know, 14 or something. It was her beat up old paperback copy, Penguin. And that felt, I think that, and she gave me around the same time Margaret Atwood and Cat's Eye. I don't know how you put those two books together in your head, but that was the kind of environment in which you would go between those two books. And I think for me, it was always, and it probably still is, and maybe that's, I don't know why it is, but the thing that entranced me was what I could see when I read, the images that those books created in my mind. And I remember that as a small child. And I don't think that curiosity about how you see a book coming to life in your mind has ever left me. So I think for me, it was the experience of reading that was always more important than a kind of who I was reading or where they were from or where they were in history. But Helen Garner was probably the first person that I thought of as being a real human being that was also a writer.
Yeah.
Partly because my mother adored her. And so that kind of brought her to life. And then I kind of wound my way through things without any real direction. I shoplifted a copy of Virginia Woolf's The Waves, and that became my kind of talisman that I kept on my body for years. And so I think I kind of went Helen Garner, Margaret Atwood, Virginia Woolf, Marguerite Duras. That was sort of my rough trajectory, but there was no order to it. And there probably still isn't, to be honest. I was always very influenced by what people were reading around me, and that was my family for a long time. But I never had a purposeful path in my reading, I don't think. Probably until I was actually really in grad school. And then I had to try, narrow it down and be focused.
Yeah. I do love the randomness of certain important books. I remember my stepdad on holiday in France took all sorts of books and I just didn't have any. And I remember when I was young, I would just see whatever book was available and just read it. And when I was about 14, one of them was The Catcher in the Rye. And, that's sort of a cliche now, but it was life-changing, to read something by this voice, a young voice, that was so distinctive and made you think in a particular kind of language. You'd wander around afterwards with that voice echoing in your head, was just a revelation to me. And it's a discussion for another day because I will just go on for hours. But I do firmly believe that there's a kind of that there are key moments in your reading history that, you know, that story of your mother giving you monkey grip when you're 14 seems kind of foundational to me. But anyway, let's talk about your essays. So Felicity, your essay is called Starting from Place and discusses the work of two, at least on the surface of it, very different writers, Alexis Wright and Luke Carman. Can you tell us about these writers? What brings them together for you, perhaps, and a little bit about how they treat place in their fiction?
Sure. I mean, I can understand on the surface of it, you know, a fairly young white male working class writer from Western Sydney, Luke Carman obviously placed in comparison to Alexis Wright, you know, who's from an older generation, who comes from the Indigenous communities in the Gulf of Carpentaria, might seem quite different, but actually I think that they have a lot in common, and in particular I think they have a lot in common in terms of their exploration of their places, and particularly the kind of technical aspects that they use in order to explore their places. I mean, both of them, I think in particular, are doing something which I find really exciting, which is using very small local spaces, you know, in Alexis Wright's book Carpentaria. This is the kind of fictionalized town of Desperance in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and in Luke Carman's work, it's Liverpool in Western Sydney. But they are both using an incredibly intimate knowledge of a local place, its stories, its histories, its memories, and its people, to tell a story which is at once incredibly local but national and international as well. So Alexis Wright's work is not just about the people of this town of Desperance. The whole book in itself is actually a metaphor for colonialization and the history of Indigenous people fighting against colonization in Australia. And Luke Carman's book, again, you know, at once it's a very local book about a fictionalized character called Luke Carman, who is kind of kicking around Western Sydney in this series of interconnected stories. But really the main character there is he's a flaneur type figure who makes these incredibly acute observations of his small world, but also how it relates to a larger world which is kind of steeped in thinking about how, in particular, Australian suburbia has changed as a result of, you know, complex waves of migration and the kinds of fears that are kind of national fears about that. And also I think it's a really interesting exploration as well of masculinity and working class masculinity. And again, I think both of these stories are, you know, they're local, they're national, they're international works. And I think that what's very exciting to me about them, and as someone who's tried to do this myself in my book No More Boats, is that opportunity that we can take as writers to pick and choose the details of the space that we are writing in order to make these really specific details mean more than one thing, but to act as objects that stand in for like a much larger conversation about who we are as a nation.
Yeah, Felicity, there's a whole writing class there in that business.
Yeah.
Taking the selection of details and because of the weight of them. Stephanie, your essay is on the short fiction of Gerald Murnane, and this is a writer often thought of as difficult. And you acknowledge some resistance in the opening to your essay. What might be the rewards of taking on the challenge of Murnane or other writers whose work doesn't perhaps grab hold of us first go?
Yeah. I guess I wanted to start by just saying how much I enjoyed Felicity's essay, and the ideas around place in that really resonated for me. And I think in some ways it dovetails with those questions you raised about Manane's work, which is that in a way, he's trying to figure out what Felicity articulates, which is, well, place is how you are, defined. It's how you discover your identity. It's also how you shape your narrative. It's contextual, all of the things. It's almost what Gerald Manane's fiction and the ones that I look at in particular are about, which is, well, it's all, I think the first experience you get with that work and with a lot of his work is profound disorientation. You don't know where you are. There is no sense of concrete place, or there's too many places, or there's too many times in the one place, that you lose that specificity as a point of navigation. In terms of that question about difficulty and why we should go there, I guess I don't like that word. I don't think it's useful, but we all use it, and we use it all the time. And I think we use it as a kind of shorthand, a shorthand to suggest it's. I think this is quite complicated. To suggest that it's not easy enough to consume this quickly. It's not giving us the expectations that we have gone there hoping will be met. But one of the things I try and explore in the essay, which I see with my students, was that we come to the things we read with a set of expectations about what we think they will give us, the kinds of experiences that they will generate for us, whether that's fast reading and immersion and escapism or some other kind of experience. I think we've kind of become used to the idea at large that a book should please us fairly quickly. And Gerald Manane's work resists that. And I think there is a pleasure in revisiting work in different ways over time, at different points in time, that we can't risk losing. And I think even when you think back to those early works that were so formative for me, Helen Garner and so on, I can reread that now and see something completely different to what I would have seen as a 14-year-old. And the same thing applies to Manane's work. It's not immediately obvious what he's doing, but there is a kind of slow reading that work asks of us, which I don't think we're often asked to do, but there's a really important and enlivening kind of experience that's there to be had. But it's like a muscle. You need to use it in the same way that learning an instrument is difficult, but you'll still get great pleasure. I mean, like, we seem to have lost that idea that it's a practice, that reading is a practice that you return to and you repeat and you revisit things and you get something more out of them. And that experience changes depending on where you're up to in your life and what's happened and what you're attending to in the text. We treat it as a point of consumption very often, rather than an engagement with the practice. And I suppose to answer just that question about difficulty, I suppose that's my take on why we should engage with works that we think of as being that. I think we use the word difficulty to not engage with those questions. It's a way of just shutting it down. That's difficult, as in that's the writer's problem, to somehow make it easy for me. And I don't really agree with that.
Yeah, it's like saying it's too hard.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. And, well, let's think about that. I mean, I think as a writer, what you're interested in is human experience. Finding something difficult or finding something boring is just as valid an experience to investigate as any other kind of easy pleasure.
There's also something in, I won't call them difficult, in books that do not meet your expectations, that asks you to consider what your expectations are. And I find that fascinating. I find reading the British novelist John McGregor's novels do that. When I read them, his novel Reservoir 13 in particular begins like a sort of missing person crime novel. So it's sort of sneaky. He seems to deliberately introduce an expectation that you are going to uncover something. And what he does with narrative, I think, is a kind of, it plants questions about what you're expecting narrative to do that I find completely fascinating. And you do have to read slowly and you have to get into a kind of a rhythm. And I like that phrase, slow reading, very much.
And I think that, I mean, that's what you need to do as a writer in your own work. I guess that's why it's an important skill if you're coming to that as a writer. You can't read your own work quickly with the idea that it will be pleasurable, because it's difficult and it's not pleasurable. You can only learn how to treat your own work with that kind of attention if you've learned that by reading someone else's work in the same way.
Absolutely, it is practice. Very useful word. Felicity, I want to just come back to your work and the things that you're trying to do, and also in relation to Wright and Carman. This word community always seems present to me. I guess it's connected to place, but it's not quite the same thing. What does this word mean to you in these works, or in what you're trying to do?
Well, I've always thought of the word community as something that speaks to the idea that a place is a collection of stories, right? Like all places are, they come from their past, their present stories as well. They come from memory, imagination, kind of collective shame and identity, and the kind of schisms that we have within communities. Within communities a lot. And I think that both Wright and Carman's work explore that incredibly well. I like, in particular, I think it's so interesting the way that Wright, particularly at the beginning of her text, is trying to write in a collective Indigenous voice, which is so interesting as well. And she's written a lot about the fact that all of her novels have been working through a question of like, how do you tell an Indigenous story that can both exist in the past and the present and the future. So how do you kind of create an authentic Aboriginal voice that speaks for the past, present and future of story? And then she kind of breaks off into individual stories in that book, which seem to kind of take over. You also get a sense of the voices of people whose stories aren't necessarily being narrated by the characters in the text. Like, so for example, the white people in the town who are constantly kind of pushing against the Indigenous characters. Even it's interesting in that text, in the language that the kind of that people of Pricklebush use is quite different than the language of the white people who exist on the periphery of the town and who sometimes come to kind of assert their authority. It's the same with Luke Carman. You get very clearly, one of the things that I find really interesting about that text is that it's quite jarring in terms of you get this kind of rough, uncultured kind of voice of like this working class boy, and a lot of the scenes are like Luke Carman is a teenager in this book, kind of uneducated, unworldly, and then all of a sudden that's kind of paired with a few lines from like Auden or or Yeats or Bob Dylan or any of the other authors that he quotes in this hugely metafictional text. I think that's interesting as well, because it replicates the way that communities can be kind of insular and small, but that they're always kind of wrapping up as well against these kind of worldly stories. And then often our perception of ourselves is shaped by them. I mean, it's interesting in both of these texts, you get a sense of like both what it is to live inside and outside that community. And you get this sense that what is implied as well is that the authors of these texts have been both an intimate part of these communities and have seen them from the outside, and that's the only way that they could have actually written the text that they have written. And I find that interesting as well, the way that we can that our sense of our community is both shaped by our own experience of it and the way that it is mediated through others. And certainly Indigenous communities and Western Sydney communities are very heavily mediated through, our perception of them is very heavily mediated through, the media and film and such. I hope that answered your question, but those are all the kinds of things that I find very interesting about community in these texts in particular.
Yeah, that question of seeing community from inside and outside sort of speaks to questions of writing more generally, doesn't it? You know, I don't want to lean too hard on some sort of romantic solitary figure, but there's a tension between writing and being part of a community, because you have to sort of, in some sense, separate a little bit from it to write about it. And
yeah, which is so clear in both of their work, not just the works I'm talking about in this essay, but like in their entire body of work.
Yeah. And how they negotiate that tension in their writing is really compelling. Stephanie, so you've already mentioned, when I use that word difficult, that the appeal of rereading, the kind of attraction of that, of going back. And I was particularly interested in your essay about the ideas that you find patterns and then you go digging around in them. What's that about? What are you finding and what are you doing?
I guess there's an answer to that is specific to Murnane, and then there is maybe something else in it that's just about a reading practice more generally. I mean, I think in Murnane, it's funny, I was listening to you speak, Felicity, and feeling full of admiration that you could remember all of that. Partly because the thing that I find with Murnane, and I do think it is common to his work, I don't think it's just a mental blip that I'm having, or at least it's about
totally.
His work. I can't ever remember it properly. Like, it seems to... there's something about the surface texture that is so smooth. There's such an opacity to it that you're inside the work and then it kind of evaporates. And I can just remember these little points of connection. So there's something about finding connections in Murnane's work that was the only way I could work my way through it to get a sense of what was happening as a whole, because the difficulty of reading it was that it was so evasive. And so I found myself reading it and rereading it, and the more I could see the patterns, the more I could kind of unlock the code to the work. And I guess if it's a question of kind of elaborating that idea of finding patterns accidentally, in that you read something, you notice something, you notice it again, 5 pages later, there's the same kind of thing happening, whether that's a technical thing or an issue of craft or a kind of character sensibility. You use that almost as a way of decoding that author's style, for me, I guess. And that's what I was trying to do with Murnane, was to think about the way in which repetitions across his work seem almost happenstance at first. And the more frequently I returned to them, the more I started to see those as actually being the keys to opening up what he was doing at large in his work. It was a repeating pattern. It was the signature, if you like, of what he was doing. And I think you can kind of extrapolate that and do that with other work as well. Or I find myself doing a similar thing, which was, I mean, because I'm teaching at the moment, I'm thinking of the things I'm teaching now. But if I were to think of a Deborah Levy novel, for example, I'd notice the concrete objects over and over again until I realized that actually what she's doing is something with the idea of concrete material and its relationship to psychoanalysis. Like, there are these codes that are embedded, not deliberately, but are there for you to kind of find. And from that, to think about what that author is doing at the level of style. And that's where your apprenticeship kind of begins, I think.
And it's interesting how with rereading you read things on different levels. So sometimes, you might just get a sense that these objects are being repeated in Levy, and there's a kind of resonance that doesn't register consciously, but then might when you reread, or when you teaching is a form of rereading as well, a kind of becoming conscious of certain things and talking about them, and then the students telling you things that you hadn't noticed as well. Sort of collective rereading that's very exciting, I think.
I think it kind of gestures to, for me, when I was doing that essay, it was a way of thinking about what Murnane was trying to do in his own, for himself as a writer. What were the intentions of the work, or what were his intentions as a writer, without imposing something on that in terms of meaning or interpretation or the significance of that more broadly, but what was inherent to that work of art that was important. And I guess I'm interested in how we read like that, what that means.
Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to ask you both a question about the emotions of reading like a writer, because, you know, often we don't mention feelings. I like to mention them frequently. Something happens, and, you know, back to this idea of reading as a young person, something emotional happened because we became writers, and I think there's some sort of transference, and it's an emotional transference for me anyway. So I'm wondering what you feel when you read a book that you deeply admire, or what the combination of feelings is. Maybe Felicity, you could start us off.
I feel like it cracks the whole world open, like particularly for me as a writer. Like I'm always looking at ways to write. I'm trying to find different languages, like not on like a literal level, but I am even recently I was asked to write an essay on class and motherhood, and I just couldn't find the language to write this essay in. And then I started reading Eula Bliss, she talks about how class is contained in the small objects and moments in time that appear uncanny. And it just it cracked a whole world open for me, because I thought, oh yeah, because that's it. I was trying to move away from trying to write about this subject really obviously and in a way that just seemed really cliche to me. And so I kind of took that as my premise. And I borrowed her form as well. She writes in these kind of mini essays, and within those mini essays, she writes in kind of almost in dot point form, like in very small little paragraphs and scenes. And it gave me the language with which to write about this topic that I knew I had stuff to say about, but I didn't know how to say it. And I feel like that's what writers do, and that's what a writer like Alexis Wright and Luke Carman have done for me as well, because I am really interested, in writing those small local stories. But, again, I'm interested in how those small things that we see every day, those kind of repeated objects like Stephanie talks about, I'm really interested in the way that those things can become almost otherworldly and surreal, and therefore actually stand for real emotions and real things and real consequences. And I think that those writers do that amazingly and give us a kind of a structure for thinking about how we can also do that. So all I can just say is that I'm filled with excitement, and then I want to go and write.
Yeah, there's some sort of charge. How about you, Stephanie?
Can you tell me the question again?
It was about the feelings evoked by books that you deeply admire.
They're so various, and I really agree with Felicity. You kind of go looking for something that breaks the world open. Like there are some books where I can read them and just feel carried along, and it's pleasurable. And there are other books that seem to kind of unlock something, and you have to respond. There is a sense of you're compelled to enter into dialogue with that work by writing something yourself. And I think if I'm not reading something, when I can't find a book that does that, my writing seems to also kind of dry up a bit. That it always feels like there is an emotional dialogue, an intellectual dialogue, something else going on that's between you and another work that you're reading, that's always there on the periphery, sometimes quite directly. I don't know how you describe that emotion. I think there's something, when you talk about transference, I think there's something in that, but there is a kind of textural difference that is about the emotion you feel in relation to a book that's not like the emotions you feel, I don't know, in relation to talking to a friend. I don't know what, there is an incredible intimacy to it, and a kind of anonymousness. I don't know what the word is, but you're left alone in private to feel very intimate with something that is not belonging to you in a way, and then you respond to that. again, kind of in the privacy of your own head without really thinking anyone will see it.
You said dialogue several times. I think that's a really interesting word. It's a kind of it's an exchange, but it's an exchange that the writer doesn't know about. And sometimes it can be a slightly unsettling experience when somebody tells you about your book to you, and I almost forget that other people are reading it and having their own experiences, and that it exists in this other place, and that they're having a conversation with me that I don't know about unless they come and stand in front of me, except for reviewers. But that's quite a formal, that's a different kind of conversation, I think. I have an audience question or an audience comment set of elements that come to mind thinking about this. So thank you, Dashiell. So Dashiell is curious about the dynamics of incorporating reading into your writing. What happens when other voices are placed into the text, among others, and as well the ethical injunctions we have to these voices. I think this is a very hot topic, particularly Indigenous authors. Do either of you have any thoughts about that?
So the question has many layers there, right? So the first part is, how do we insert our reading into our writing? And the second part is, what are the kind of ethical implications of that? Like, firstly, if I can go back to kind of what Alexis Wright has written about a lot. One of the things that she has spoken a lot about in interviews is the fact that she is heavily influenced not just by the stories and oral histories of Indigenous people, but that she has been heavily influenced by like poets like the Irish poet Seamus Heaney, and that she has been heavily influenced in the use of magical realism by Latin writers. She, as Lydia Ning argues in her collection, her introduction to a collection of essays on Alexis Wright. Alexis Wright is an incredibly transnational writer who borrows frequently from the voices of other writers who are not necessarily from her cultural background. So when I say borrow, I don't necessarily mean that she puts herself into the head of somebody who's from a very different cultural background and write from it. But she's heavily influenced by writers who are of different cultures. And I think that I can see that when I read the best kind of writing, that these are writers who have read not just their own national literatures, but international literature, and are heavily influenced by the voices of those of others. I'm not sure if I'm misinterpreting your question here, but is the second part of your question about whether or not we can write from other cultural perspectives?
I think I suppose so. I think there's a dimension of just like this kind of normative ethical injunction, not just Indigenous cultures, but what happens to voices as they come into the text, how do they interact with our own, and yeah, how do you wrestle with that, whether they can't gain kind of any form of agency on their own. I know it's a very open-ended question, and one hopefully that we can't answer in a way. But yeah.
I don't know. I'm always wrestling with the voices of others, and actually, in a lot of my works, my characters are always wrestling with the voices of others as well. Like my latest book, Girls and Boys Cars, is about this girl literally sitting in a jail cell, like reading other books and trying to work out what she can take from those books to tell her own story. But I kind of think that that's the process of what writers go through, and I don't think that it's cultural appropriation to be influenced by other people's writing styles. That I actually think that that's a celebration of the ways that we can and should speak to one another. I think, to me, the issue of maybe climbing in somebody else's head and representing another culture or another sexuality or even another class is quite a different issue. For me, it's like I'm incorporating other voices to show how I can converse with them and almost buck against them. I'm often my characters are from my cultural perspective, but they are talking to people from other cultural perspectives. And part of the reason why I include that is because I want to write from my cultural perspective about how people like me see other people, and I want to write about the fact that that causes conflict, and I want to be honest about that, and I want to be honest about the fact that those conversations sometimes aren't polite. Luke Carman certainly is in his work, very much so, and I admire that he doesn't try to climb into somebody else's head, but he talks about the strangeness of other people from his own perspective, and is honest about that kind of like the fear and strangeness of the other. I think that's really great, but I think, yeah, climbing in somebody else's head is a whole nother issue, and something that I'm disinclined to do. I want to leave some space for Stephanie to respond.
It's a really interesting question. Thank you. I guess in the first instance, that kind of use of the broad use of other people's work, to me, always seems like an act of homage if you're not actually ripping them off. And that it's the job of a critic, in a sense, to then go back and unpick someone's work and say, well, here's an influence and here's an influence, and this is how they formulated their voice. So in a way, if you want to respond through homage, whether that's, in whatever way that you want to, I don't see that as being a kind of issue, and it's a necessary part of developing your own sense of style and sensibility. In terms of inhabiting the characters or voices of others, I guess I have a few thoughts on that. One, in a very practical sense, in that I have done that with my second novel, where I drew on oral histories and archival oral histories from Anglo-Indian migrants that were not, I wasn't connected to those. It was my family's history, my family's story. I used their oral histories and they gave me permission to use them, but I used oral histories that were not my own as well, with respect to those communities. But there was also a really interesting point when I was taking the oral histories directly from people I knew, where we had an agreement that I would use those in the way that I saw fit, and that they were okay with that they understood I was going to use them for fiction purposes. And they said, you're the writer, do that. So then we had an agreement on that, and I couldn't have written the book if those people in my life hadn't said, here's my story, I want you to tell it in the way that you think is the best way to tell it. I guess in response to this idea of whether you can inhabit someone else's perspective and their experience or not, I think I have two quite different ideas on that. One of which is, in my nonfiction, I would absolutely stick to my own experience and my own perspective and interrogate that. And that is the kind of official parameters of those nonfiction pieces, is that this is about my limitations and perceptions. In fiction, and I have this conversation a lot in my classes, I actually almost feel that you are philosophically obliged to try and enter into someone else's experience, and to try and do that with a sense of real wonder and courage and curiosity. I almost can't think of a novel that I've read that I've been really moved by where there haven't been multiple perspectives and experiences, and there's no way in the world that author could have known or experienced all of those things. So for me, it's a question of doing that with humility and curiosity and a real sense of wanting to know what something feels like, and wanting to inhabit an experience of otherness in a way that is pertinent and relevant to the fictional practice. I am writing fiction. I'm not writing nonfiction. If I wanted to be limited to my own perspective, I would write nonfiction only. And I would probably only read nonfiction if I wanted to only have the true experience of others. I'm interested in the way those boundaries between us in our cultural lives, in our emotional lives, psychologically, are porous, and the way in which they blur, and what we learn from each other by engaging with that kind of exchange.
I think that might be a fantastic place to bring the conversation to an end. Thank you so much for your insights. And I always hoped when we were putting this book of essays together that we might have conversations like this. COVID had other plans about various things, but that was just so enriching, and I will think on these things for some time. Isabel, is there anything else you want to say before we close?
I just want to thank you to the whole panel and to the audience for coming. It was a really great discussion. If you see this before tomorrow, do come to our book club. If you see it a bit later, do read the whole book. It's available as an ebook in the UCIT library. Yeah, and thank you everyone for being here and for these amazing thoughts and ideas. And even though I'm not a writer, I will also have a lot to think about in the next few weeks and months. So thank you.
Thanks, Belinda. Thanks, Felicity.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye.